This is the third episode of a series that have been planned and conceived with Paulina Cornejo from Centro University. This series is about social innovation, and it allows us to dig into what is social innovation for designers and how design relates to social innovation. For this, we have interviews with people working in design from different disciplines, not only designers. For example, we have previously interviewed Matus and Mariana Fulgueiras, who are anthropologists closely working with designers. This series has 5 interviews, and it includes work from Chile, Venezuela, Mexico, the US, and New Zealand. Our guest today is Cheryl Heller. She's an American business strategist and designer. She's the founding chair of the first MAFA program in Design for Social Innovation at the School of Visual Art, and she also teaches at Centro. In this interview, we talk about her work as educator and as a designer. We talk about foster care and designing for the real world. Why did you invite Cheryl, Paulina?
Collaborating with Cheryl over the past years has led me to discover a very practical side of social design or design for social innovation, and helped me understand how to put it into more precise words. Cheryl is perhaps the person from which I've learned the most about this. She's an extraordinary colleague and teacher who, by taking students through the design process, helps them discover unsuspected insights, not only in relation to the people or context they work with, but in relation to themselves and their own transformation through these processes. My name is Paulina Cornejo.
My name is Mariana Salgado. This is Diseño y Diáspora.
I'm Cheryl Heller. I am delighted to be here. I have been a designer my whole life, and what being a designer means to me has changed continually since I was just out of college. I have worked with many businesses as communication designer and a design strategist, and at a certain point I had an epiphany crisis epiphany, and became very interested in using what I knew to help organizations that I believe in. And so I made a big and not so fast or elegant transition to working in what we now call social design, working with foundations, working with entrepreneurs who are looking for new models of how to work and how to live and how to contribute to equity and environmental justice.
And why do you think it was a non-elegant transition?
Well, someone said, who knows me well, that my motto in life is there must be a harder way to do this. And there was at the time nothing called social innovation, nothing called social design. And I basically had to just sort of feel my way to it. I knew that I was very unhappy, feeling like I was helping big companies get bigger, even though I learned a lot. And so it was painful. It was painful because I went back to not knowing what I was doing, and it took a number of years. And that led to meeting a man who was he was chair of the design and advertising schools at the School of Visual Art in New York. And he said, "Why don't you teach?" And I said, "That's never going to happen. I travel all the time and I don't like kids that much. And I hear the pay is terrible. So why would I do that?" And he persuaded me to try teaching a class. And he said, "You can make it anything you want. And I'll send the kids to your studio. So I'll send the students to you. You don't even have to come to the school." And I thought about what was missing. And it struck me that what was missing in design education was a way to connect design to the world, that designers are taught tools and technique and processes, but not how to connect themselves deeply or their skills to actually accomplishing things, and how to be aware and responsible for what did come of the work they did.
And how do you teach that?
Yeah, you teach that very deeply and with a reflective process. You teach it through practice and by including people that are participants in the design process. You teach that by not letting people sit in a classroom all the time, by not teaching theory and assuming that theory is all that's needed to become a responsible whole systems designer. And you'll tell me if I'm going on too much. You'll interrupt me, right?
Yeah, I'm interrupting you all the time.
Good. Yeah, I like that. I don't like to ramble. Anyway, so the class that I started led to a question about what that class would look like as a graduate program. And I said, I don't know. So why don't we try that? And that was, I was at the School of Visual Art for 15 years, maybe 16. And what we founded was the first master's program in social design. And
when was it?
Started it's still going on. So it launched in 2012, late 2012 or 2013. It's coming up on its 10th anniversary.
Wow.
And yeah, and it was a wonderful learning experience for everyone involved. And I have really extraordinary alumni who are working all over the world in government.
And you were the one doing these partnerships with NGOs and the government. And how did this? Because I guess like a lot of schools around the world, they could be interested to kind of copy the model. So I am interested in how did you do it? Like how did you build these partnerships? And it's not easy, I guess, at the beginning, no?
Paulina knows. In the beginning, it's a lot of, it's going to be great. You're going to love it. It's going to be, yeah. I mean, launching a program, we had no alums. We had no history. We had no evidence. We had no faculty for the second year because we didn't know what the second year would need. It is really, it was my whole life. It was every relationship that I had. It was every friend that I respected who had worked in the public sector, in, foundations. I said, you have to come and teach. You have to be a part of this. And so the principal concept is that you, or for me, it was, this thing cannot be separate from the world. It has to be the world. And I wanted students to touch the outside world at every point, and I wanted to bring the outside world in. And that was, I had been on the board, I'd been board chair of an organization called PopTech, and we created a fellows program of entrepreneurs around the world working on these new models. And every single one of them at some point had a role in the program because they were living exemplars of design in action.
So through this work of these organizations, you kind of train designers to be assisting or like accompanying the process of different entrepreneurs, or you teach them how to be entrepreneurs in social aspects, or in the.
And the goal is to give them, number one, a sense of themselves and why they're doing what they're doing, because that's the first essential thing, right? And helping them see that they have a worldview, and everyone has a worldview, and they're all different. So intentionally, our classes were always very international and diverse in every way, right? We intentionally recruited for business students, scientists. Most of the people who took this design program were not trained in design, and so the cohorts in themselves brought remarkable experience. We had a clinical nurse who'd been working in global health. We had a woman who had just come from the London School of Economics. She was an economist. And when you have a cohort where you've got some designers and some, but they were textile designers, and And what brought everybody together was broad curiosity about the world and how it works, and a desire to use what they knew for social equity. And what I wanted to teach them was a sense of agency and the process of design, but more than that, the process of observing and listening and reflecting and being a part of this collaborative effort.
And how would you describe this more?
I'm speaking now from the perspective of having launched a program at another school at the biggest university in the United States, and of now being back in the corporate world at a company that is highly principled and committed to economic equity and energy equity. And so I can't help now but look over the spectrum of these other experiences. And much of what I do now is help people unlearn what they have inherited as part of the industrial view of the world, of the traditional view of a designer, which is you're the expert, you come in, you have better ideas than other people, you have solutions. And interestingly, the company that I'm working with now is an industrial company. So it's men. When I put together an organization, it's always, overwhelmingly female, but I'm with a bunch of guys, and I forgot, how ingrained that territory definition and hierarchy is. And so I'm just quietly trying to go back to helping people just be quiet sometimes and listen and observe and have a totally different sense of awareness of who's in the room and what their actions are. And so but that came from the program, right? Because that it's such an important part of social design. And I think it gets left out of design thinking. I think it gets left out of much of the theory and the design discourse that I've seen lately, right? It's all the designers in the center, and designers have this way of getting to the bottom of things. And again, I think it minimizes the importance of being immersed in a system and paying attention to it and being a facilitator rather than a decider.
Well, is this role of a designer accompanying? No, is this of coming with and not necessarily running or setting up the stage?
It's running with, and it's also the in systems theory, right? The notion that you can't change a system, you can intervene. You can throw a piece of bread in the water that's filled with fish, and it will, the system will change. And I think the role is like that, right? It is often being the person that says, what if we looked at it like this? What if we tried this? What if we heard from other people? So yes, it's an accompanist, but it's also kind of a good troublemaker. And if you knew Congressman John Lewis in the United States, who was famous for having been with Martin Luther King and part of the civil rights movement, a bloody part of the civil rights movement, he would always say, you have to make good trouble.
But being a troublemaker, isn't it doing a fuss about yourself also? Because in a way, it's having the designer in the center if you are the troublemaker.
I think there's a difference between being aware of yourself and it being about yourself. And I think a lot, and I read a lot about animals. Birds in a flock have a double sense of themselves and their physical extremities, but also the movement of the whole flock. There are lovely essays on what people are learning about that dynamic, right? How do you be with and have both senses of awareness? So yeah, I think I always want students, and I feel myself, to have a real sense of confidence and conviction and comfort. So yeah, I do make a distinction between making trouble and the trouble having to be about you.
Okay. And I don't say that the travel has to be about you, but if you are the travel baker, in a way, you are also putting yourself in the center. I'm just trying to contradict you in order to get deeper, right?
Yeah. Well, yes. And I would say somebody has to start things, right? I just facilitated a workshop with a community in Washington, D.C. It's a foster care community. So it's a lot of the leaders of nonprofits and also some people with lived experience of the foster care system. And I mean, my role was to go and to offer them this process. It was about me sharing this process. So yes, there's absolutely a facilitation role. But then when you master design, you learn how to kind of get out of the way of what is emerging from the group. Yes, but I agree. It's a very delicate and amorphous position and condition.
So you make the trouble, and then once everybody embrace the problem, little by little fade out.
You know, it's hard to say that it happens the same way all the time, right?
Yeah. So tell me about one of these cases. I don't know if it is the one that you just mentioned, but I could like that you tell one of these design cases from the beginning to the end. Could it be possible?
Sure. Well, the foster care is an interesting one. There's an organization in the United States called Community Solutions, and they have a program called Built for Zero, which is ending adult homelessness in communities across the country. And I was asked by one of the original supporters of Built for Zero to help them extend their work to youth. So they had been focusing on adult chronic and veterans homelessness. And I actually, this was while I was at SVA, but we worked with, I brought in another faculty member, and we worked with students, and we started out basically talking to about 12 communities across the country to understand where they were, what the youth, issues were as they saw them. And we chose 3 communities to work more deeply with. And one of the big learnings almost immediately was that when you talk to any adult, they would say the biggest problem with youth is supporting them as they leave foster care. So foster care lasts either until someone is 18 or 21, depending on the state. And then basically it's like, well, okay, you're an adult now, you're on your own. And half the people who were homeless in the United States as adults were in the foster system. So it's a very broken part of the system. And the other thing that became immediately apparent was that everyone would say, well, of course, we should include young people in understanding what they need. Because traditionally, it's a whole bunch of adults saying, well, here's how we fix it, and here's what they need. And, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that. Nobody was looking at the whole journey of a youth, and people didn't know, even when they knew that they wanted to include young people, they didn't know how. They didn't have, people said, well, we invite them to the room and then people ignore them because they're shy and we don't know how to talk to them. And they didn't have a process. And so after the first phase, which was about a year of talking and learning from all these communities, we began to prototype design sessions where young people would be in the room, and we would use collaborative design as a way to, as a means to help these communities collaborate and for youth to be equal participants in understanding the issues and also coming up with solutions. And so it's been almost 4 years now. I've worked in Phoenix, Arizona, in Springfield, Massachusetts, in Denver, Colorado, and now in Washington, D.C. And COVID was an interesting wrinkle in that, as it has been in everything. But I'm just finishing now an online module that illustrates the design process, and we'll give it free to anyone who wants to use it in their own community to learn how to bring youth into the process as equal participants and together identify issues and solutions. And I hesitate to say solutions because not everything is a definable problem, right? But it's to identify conditions, desired conditions over existing ones, to quote Herbert Simon.
Even though not everything is a definable problem, still you come up with certain ideas that you prototype?
Yes. So, for example, one of the things we learned in Springfield that was very interesting was that, and not surprising, was that adults and youth understand words differently. They have different definitions of home. Whereas adults would say, if they have someplace to live, they got a home. And youth want to say, not all homes are secure. Not all homes are places that we want to be. And so there were wonderful discussions about that, for example, and also other metrics that people just saw very differently depending on where they were. And also things like young people think of themselves and they think about what they want for their lives. They think about their goal. The adult system tends to think of youth and put them in categories of, oh, this one, has issues. This one was rebellious. This was, and so these labels stick to them. So we looked at ways to step outside of those, the way that the system labels young people, and that sticks with them throughout their lives. And we looked for ways to help them find work, which was a huge part of what they were lacking for independence, and also mentorship programs, right? How do we connect young people to knowledge of how you get a driver's license, how to look at a lease agreement, how to manage transportation, whatever it is, how to budget your food, how to cook.
So you have a series of trainings that they kind of support themselves to be independent.
Mm-hmm.
Paulina, do you want to ask something?
Choice. Yeah.
Yes, I want to go back a little bit to when you were talking about education, Cheryl. Mm-hmm. I want to ask you if, from your point of view, I mean, you were talking about the SVA program that
what is the SVA?
The School of Visual Arts, the Masters in Social Innovation program that it's around about 10 years old, I think. Mm-hmm. And from your point of view, how has like the whole scene changed in this decade, speaking about social design or design for social innovation? Like, how do you see it, like from human-centered design and all these life-centered design, and how is environment now?
Well, interesting. There's many changes. One thing that I noticed that changed remarkably were the students and the students' goals, students' tolerance for risk, students' definition of success, right? That in the beginning, the students hadn't lived through the big recession of 2008 or 2010, right? They had missed that. And then a couple of years later, we had students who were really affected by that, right? And their parents were affected by that. So they were much more interested in getting a job. And in a funny way, not their desires weren't different, but so it affected what their goals were. And a big part of the program involved students deciding, right, what it was they wanted to do. And we were there to help them accomplish that. So students changing is one thing. Obviously, Los Estados Unidos has changed, and in really frightening ways. I think it takes a different kind of increased courage now for students to choose this and say, my life is going to be about equity and supporting equity. So in one sense, social innovation has become a more integral part of the world, right? If you look at businesses, I think I see now, because I'm working in the energy sector, there is enormous support to deal with climate change, right? Whatever the politics are, there is just enormous investment, emotional investment, financial investment, innovation going into let's get away from fossil fuel, let's solve this. And so in one sense, I'm finding business so different than it was before. It's not the same kind of mindless, let's make money, or at least where I am. And so in a funny way, it's a more integrated part of that. In terms of design, I think design has also matured. There are so many programs now, so many different names for design that it makes me a little sad that we are fragmenting, that you have participatory designers and social designers and innovation designers and collaborative designers and design thinkers. And I don't think we're doing ourselves a service. And I'm not sure if I'm answering your question completely, but I also have now seen, I'm involved in Babson, which is the #1 school for innovation in the world. I see the desire that students there have for integrating social innovation in their work. And Arizona State was another sort of environment where entrepreneurship was a huge part of the drive. And yeah, there's an expectation that there will be a social aspect of it and a justice aspect of it.
When you started this program, like, were you talking about environment at all, or were you just talking about like human needs and people and like an empathy? So do you see like a change in the inclusion of environment, or like a deeper development of conscious in that sense?
Well, I have always cared about the environment, and I've always tried to make it part of the conversation. I always say humans are my least favorite species, and white people are my least favorite humans. And I mean that, right? I think our fixation with humans is our demise, right? It is why we're in this trouble, because we think the world is here to be devoured and destroyed by us. So yes, I think climate change has evolved that conversation, but I still think, human beings are too focused short term, too focused on kind of human comfort. And I don't think I don't think the environment is a big enough part of learning and student life. And I think that what Facebook is doing with, or not doing with Meta, and the absorption by all young people in their screens is a terrible, tragic trend.
I also want to ask you about your measuring projects. I know you've been working a lot in, you had a previous project, the Measure Deep project, and you've been interested also in measuring progress in different projects you've been involved also in education. So can you tell us a little bit about this and how it relates to what you're doing now?
Sure. This began, maybe 6 years ago now, with I had been teaching in this graduate program that I founded, and at a certain point I said, I really have no idea if this works. We have all of this anecdotal evidence, and everyone feels like it works, and everyone feels like it makes a difference, including my friends at big foundations. But there's no way to stand up in a group of data-driven people and say, yes, here's why a design approach is better. And so we launched this project called Measured that began as an event where we invited people from all over the world to come and share their progress on measuring the role that design plays and the importance of design. And from that, we developed a research program where we looked for cases of people measuring design. But of course, we started out saying there are no cases, because what we learned is nobody has figured out how to measure it. So we thought we'll choose successful programs, and Built for Zero was one of them, this program looking at ending adult homelessness. and sort of work backwards and make a structure for a case so that people can use that. So there's a website at measured.design where those cases live. And then it's, I continue to look at it in my work, but also my dissertation was on how we can measure the effect that our language has on whether we achieve equity, and the way that language affects, the way that using sort of old power structure, language that reflects old power structures, actually just supports those old power structures and doesn't disrupt them.
This interview is part of the list Innovación Social, Estados Unidos y Diseño, Diseño Sostenible y Educación en Diseño. There are many persons that understand what is wrong in a certain context, but not many that have the capabilities and the chance to propose an alternative. Cheryl understood that in design education it was missing the connection with the real world. She founded a new design program in Design for Social Innovation and make it happen. This was many years ago. Now, Paulina, you are starting a program on the same subject 10 years later. Why do we need this program now?
One of the best descriptions I found of social design is Cheryl's description of it as design of social relationships. So I think we need a program of design of social innovation because we will always require social relationships, especially when we live in a complex, polarized, and extremely digitally connected, but socially and environmentally broken world. Now, the reason for creating this program was the evident complexity of the social and environmental challenges we face, but also the difficult access to this content and education for many people in Latin America. Before ours, the only program offered was an on-site master in Nariño, Colombia, while the other programs were in English, mostly offered by schools in Europe and the US. Our online accredited program is the first of its kind in Spanish, and this allows students to learn and discuss in their own language and apply design for social innovation or social design in their own context and realities. One final reason probably connects with the same spirit that led you to create Diseño Diáspora. There are many of us working in design or working maybe under different names, but interested in the same issues. It really doesn't matter. We definitely need to be connected to amplify our impact, and this will most likely happen if we are also able to talk and publish, discuss, and trigger and ignite more conversations also in Spanish.
Let's continue listening to Cheryl that has a lot to tell us. So when I ask you for a case, you choose the case of the homeless and the youth. But then you mentioned that you are working in energy. So I was kind of confused. You work as a consultant for different projects, or are you working as an in-house designer in a company doing something in relation to energy?
That's an excellent question. I took a job as chief design officer at an energy company that is young, that is manufacturing the first lithium-ion batteries that are safe to use in occupied buildings. So I'll give you 1 minute. There is lots of renewable energy, wind, hydro, and solar. Right now, all of that renewable energy gets piped through our existing electrical grid, and when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing, there is no way to store that energy, and so the system reverts to fossil fuel. So the missing piece of this has been ways to store energy where it's needed so that the renewable energy can be stored, used when in peak times and when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing, and that eliminates the need for fossil fuel. It also becomes less reliant on this antiquated grid, which is not resilient. And so that's what the company I took a job for is doing. And I took a job because I don't think you can be the kind of troublemaker that you need to be as a consultant. I think it's too easy to ignore people. And as I've mentioned, I'm in here with all the guys. And I said when I took the job, I do this other work. I'm working on the Foster Project and I'm teaching. And so everybody knows. And I think it's much more fun to have multiple things going.
Yes, I completely agree. So my last question in relation to this is that do you connect the teaching with your work? So do you also get students to do certain things at work, or do you have like a kind of way of fusionating
Absolutely.
both?
Yes. And I will give you an example. I mentioned energy equity, right? If we are really going to transition to a zero carbon grid, it means that everybody's going to have access to it. It can't be just rich people who are able to, once again, afford the green, clean. And so I'm having a group of students at Babson look at, okay, what are the public-private partnerships? What are the models that allow you to sell something that is going to be expensive in the beginning to people who can't afford it? And there are examples of businesses that have done that. So I have already asked some students to make that their project. How do we, from an economic standpoint, how do we make that work?
Perfect. So you are not working with the design students in this case specifically?
In the case of Babson, yes, but I'm also having conversations with another school that is a design school in New York City, and I can't say what it is.
Promoting transdisciplinary work.
Yes.
So can we go for the last questions, or do you have any before, Paulina? Yes.
I have one, but I don't know if you can hear the train.
Yeah, don't worry. No.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Yes, you mentioned, Cheryl, that your work was quiet work and that it was more about raising awareness. But I was wondering, how do you do this work? Like, can you explain us a little bit more? What's your role in this company? What is it about, like in your day-to-day? What's your mission there?
Yeah, it's really interesting because because it's a startup, right? So a certain amount of the work so far has been developing a narrative. What we're doing is invisible. And by the way, the company started out making electric construction equipment. So imagine all of the big earth movers and diggers and backhoes and all those things. They're electric. And so there's no exhaust, there's no noise, there's no carbon. And people understand that. It's like, oh, can I drive one? No. But now the big part of what we're doing is making making big batteries that run. We've just installed one in a medical research company that is going to power an electron microscope that the grid could not supply power to. But you can't see that, right? It's not as sexy as a big backhoe. And so a lot of what I've been spending my time thinking about is, how do we develop that narrative? What does it look like? What does it sound like? And then, of course, we've just done a new identity that represents that in the website. But now I'm looking at, if you want to really represent equity, how do you do that? And I should say we've also formed a nonprofit. The company is located in a very poor neighborhood in Buffalo. In fact, it's the neighborhood where those shootings just took place. And so I've been involved in launching a nonprofit that will recruit and train people from the neighborhood so that the economic opportunity is shared. So how do you find ways to live those principles, and how do you find behavior that you can model that gets those started? So it's very much there's things you can see, and then there's processes. Design is important as a way to sort of orchestrate how people work together and get everybody thinking about the same vision and the same picture. So I have to say, it's interesting because I think not many people here understand what design is, and I don't understand where it's going to go, right? I mean, I think the most wonderful part about a designer is I have no idea like what the right thing to do is, but I know we have a process for finding it and that it works. And so there's a lot of that, right? I mean, this is the reason I came to this company is because the ambition is so enormous that this really has to happen and will happen. And in a sense, nobody knows how, I mean, we're trying to do something that hasn't been done, which I always told my students, nobody's figured this out. They can figure out how to get a rocket ship into outer space or now a telescope, but we can't figure out how to end racism. So nobody knows what the solution looks like, and we're all on a path to getting there.
And if we want to read, listen, watch more about this type of work, what could you recommend? What is inspiring you right now?
Well, that's a hard question. I'm listening to a 45-hour biography of Sylvia Plath, the poet.
Ah, yes.
I don't read about design. I have never thought reading about design is the way. I read about nature. I read about new ways of thinking about business.
Okay, but recommend us what? I don't mind if it is about nature. I read about a lot of different things.
Okay.
What it could be the last book that you read that you really thought like, yes?
One of my favorite books is called Rooted in the Land, and it's about nature and place and nature, and it's an anthology. So it's about nature and place from every perspective. It's the book that has this wonderful essay on the experience of being an individual in a flock. So I recommend that highly because it's so connected to design. Let's see, there's an amazing writer named McFarlane, and he writes about language and the loss of language. He writes about places where there are words for a very particular state of frost on buds as opposed to a different state of frost on buds. I can send you the names and you can publish them. But he's written a lot. He did a wonderful interview in Granta. Yeah.
And for the future, what could you imagine that you could like to do in the future? Because you have been having a very colorful and different path, and you have been doing a lot of things. How do you envision yourself in the future?
Two different things. I'm starting to paint again, which I haven't done in years, but I always thought I wanted another period in my life where I painted because that's how I started in undergraduate school. But I also now am kind of hooked on having an influence at a much bigger level, right? And in the beginning of my career, I worked a lot with big corporations, with American Express, with Ford Motor Company, with Marriott Hotels, and they were big and vast. And I always felt like it didn't matter what I did, right? I mean, even at Ford Motor Company, it was so big that it didn't matter what the president did almost, right? It's like no single person could really transform it. That's probably not true. But I feel now like we have here at this little company, the possibility of really changing things and sticking our finger in the fan and making a lot of good trouble. And so I'm really intrigued by the opportunity to do that. And I feel really fortunate to be in this spot and to be in a place where nobody knows what a designer is, and so they can't tell me what to do.
Thanks a lot for the interview.
Thank you. Great to meet you.
Cheryl tells us that design has matured. There are many different names for design. It makes me sad that we are fragmented. We are not doing ourselves a service. I aligned with her thought that having many names separate designers and make more niche and bubbles. Are you an UX designer or an industrial designer? When some of us has been working in different design fields, this seems ridiculous because it does not allow us to learn from each other. This is one of the reasons that I choose for this podcast the name Design and Diaspora. Diaspora is the other, the one we want to connect with, the other territory in which some of us that do not live in our home countries live. It could have been design and territory or design and the context, but the diaspora described the otherness and the ownership of a place, and at the same time, the togetherness with the community. In this case, this podcast is about building a wider community of people interested and working around design, without exclusion of the other, the one that has not studied or does not believe that he or she is a designer, and not separating us in fields. Coming back to the definition of what kind of designers we are, we definitely need to do better to describe for others what we are doing, especially when we are dealing with this abstract part of design, the design that does not relate to the material world. For a lot of service designers, strategic designers, futurist designers, participatory designer, experimentalists, it is hard to assign us a title. We need to find a way to get rid of these titles and describe our ways of doing with more nuances and embracing the complexity that it has. What do you think, Paulina?
Yes, Mariana. I think the discussion about the name we should have is endless. And it does not only happen in this field. There are boundaries that are constantly crossed, and that is partly why it is so difficult to define or give it a title. However, despite the fact that we approach complexity from the name itself, I will return to Cheryl's description, which I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, and which also has to do with the connection that you were mentioning regarding Diseño y Diáspora. I think that that's also why it works for me, because it's simple. Social design is the design of relationships.
As always, the music of this podcast is by Antonio Zimmerman. The sound design is by Andy Fecci. This program is published with Creative Commons license with attributions. This is Diseño y Diáspora. You can follow us in our social media channels in YouTube, Instagram, or Twitter, or visit our website. Remember to recommend us and recommend our books. Let's listen to the next one.